Kenji Sato's voice filled the dojo like a drum. Ichi. 40 fists punched the air in perfect unison. The sound was a single crack, sharp and clean, like a tree splitting in a storm. And 40 fists again. Same sound, same angle, same controlled fury. Sato paced the front of the floor with slow, deliberate steps. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from rock. His black belt was old and frayed at the edges, not from carelessness but from years. Hundreds of them. That worn fabric meant more in this room than any trophy or certificate ever could. When he turned to face his students, his eyes moved across them the way a general inspects his soldiers before battle, looking for softness, looking for doubt, finding neither. The 40 students held their form between each count, back straight, knees bent deep, front fists extended, rear fists pulled tight against their ribs. Not one elbow drifted, not one chin tilted up. They had done this drill 10,000 times. Their bodies no longer needed to think about it. The movement lived in their muscles now, the way breathing does. In the bleachers, a few of the tourists shifted in their seats. One leaned toward another and whispered something. The man beside him shook his head slowly, eyes still fixed on the floor. The black belts sitting in the front row did not watch the drilling students. They watched the crowd. There were 6 of them. They sat with their arms folded and their backs straight, still wearing their GIs, still carrying the quiet authority of men who had spent years earning the right to sit exactly where they were sitting. Their eyes moved steadily along the rows of spectators, not with hostility, but with the calm attention of men who were trained to notice everything. A shift in posture, a whisper held too long, a face that didn't belong. This was part of the demonstration too, though no one had announced it. The message was not only in Sato's commands, or in the thunder of 40 synchronized fists. It was also in those 6 pairs of watching eyes. It was in the way the front row felt like a border you did not cross. The visiting Korean delegation sat very still. The journalists scribbled without looking down at their notebooks. Even the businessmen in loosened ties had stopped talking. San. The fists cracked again. Louder this time. It seemed, though nothing had changed. Maybe the room had simply gotten quieter around the sound. Sato stopped pacing. He turned fully to face his students and raised one hand. The room dropped into total silence between one breath and the next. 40 bodies held their position without swaying, without adjusting, without a single unnecessary movement. The overhead lights hummed. Someone in the upper rows coughed once, then seemed to regret it. Sato lowered his hand. The students rose from their stances together, heels coming down with a soft, unified thud. They turned to face the crowd in a single motion and bowed, sharp, precise, exactly 30 degrees, held for exactly 2 seconds. Then they straightened. A ripple of nervous applause came from the upper rows. It sounded small in that room. It sounded like it belonged somewhere else. One of the black belts in the front row glanced toward the far end of the bleachers for just a moment, then returned his gaze to the center of the room. Nothing in his face changed. But the look had lasted just long enough to remind everyone in that section that they had been seen. Near the back of the room, behind a group of Korean visitors and 2 men in press lanyards, the wooden bench creaked softly as someone settled into their seat. No one turned to look. There was nothing remarkable about the sound. People had been shifting and settling since the demonstration began. And the man who had just sat down in the plain short-sleeved shirt gave no one a reason to look twice. He sat with his hands relaxed on his knees, his posture easy, his face calm. He watched Kenji Sato walk back to the center of the floor. And he looked, to anyone who bothered to glance his way, like a man who had simply wandered in off the street. Akira Tanaka had been coming to the Morimoto Dojo demonstrations for 3 years. He was a schoolteacher from Narima, 28 years old, with thin-framed glasses and a habit of arriving early to get a seat near the middle of the bleachers, close enough to see clearly, far enough back to feel safe. He had no martial arts training. He came because the demonstrations made him feel something he couldn't quite name, something between admiration and fear. He liked that feeling, as long as he could feel it from a distance. He knew the routine by now, the synchronized drills, the board breaking, the slow walk of the black belts along the front row. He knew when to clap and when to stay quiet. He knew not to make eye contact with anyone on the floor. So when his attention drifted sideways during the short pause between drills, it was just habit. just the restless eyes of a man who noticed things. That was when he saw the man in row 1. He was sitting 3 seats to Tanaka's left, close enough that Tanaka could see him clearly without turning his head fully. The man was lean, not thin in a weak way, but in the way a wire is thin. Compact. Like nothing on him was extra. He wore a simple short-sleeved shirt, dark trousers, and plain shoes. No camera. No notebook. No program folded in his lap. His hands rested on his knees, open and relaxed, fingers slightly curved. He wasn't clapping. He hadn't clapped during the drills either, Tanaka realized. Not because he seemed bored. It was something else. He was watching the floor the way a craftsman watches another craftsman work, with calm, careful attention. Like he was reading something in the movements that the rest of the crowd couldn't see. Tanaka pushed his glasses up and looked more carefully. At the front of the floor, Hiroshi Takeda had stepped out from the side door. The change in the room was immediate. The remaining conversation in the bleachers stopped. The journalists straightened. The Korean delegation shifted forward slightly in their seats. Even the black belts in the front row sat a little more upright, though they would never have admitted it. Takeda was not a tall man, but he filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with height. His shoulders were wide, his neck thick. His hands hanging at his sides like tools that had been used hard and often. His GI was brilliant white and perfectly pressed. His black belt was not frayed like Sato's. It was new and dark and tied with the kind of precise, knot that said everything about the man without a single word. He walked to the center of the floor and stopped. He did not bow to the crowd. He did not smile. He stood and he looked out at the bleachers with the flat, steady gaze of a man who was entirely comfortable being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. His eyes moved slowly along the rows. Not searching, just confirming. Tanaka felt his stomach tighten the way it always did at this moment. He glanced back at the man in row 1. The man in the plain shirt was still watching Takeda. His expression had not changed. There was no tightening in his jaw, no straightening of his back, no small involuntary shift away from what he was seeing. His shoulders stayed loose. His hands stayed open. He looked, Tanaka thought, like a man watching rain fall. Then Takeda's gaze reached row 1. It stopped. It was only a second. Maybe less. But in a room that quiet, a second was long enough to feel. Takeda's eyes settled on the lean man in the plain shirt, and something moved behind them. Not confusion exactly, but a small hesitation. The kind a predator makes when it encounters something that doesn't behave the way prey is supposed to behave. The lean man held the gaze without blinking. Then Takeda looked away, back to the center of the room, and raised one hand to signal Sato to continue. Tanaka let out a slow breath. He looked again at the man beside him, the calm hands, the easy posture, the eyes that had not flinched. For the first time since he had started attending these demonstrations, Akira Tanaka found himself watching someone other than Hiroshi Takeda. The stack of tiles was 4 inches thick. Takeda had set them up himself, without ceremony, the way a carpenter sets up a piece of wood he has already decided how to cut. For tiles balanced on 2 low wooden blocks at the center of the floor. He stood over them for a moment, rolled his right shoulder once, and then was still. The room held its breath. His right hand rose slowly above the tiles. Fingers flat and pressed together, the edge of his palm turned downward. He held it there for 3 full seconds. Not for drama. Not for the crowd. He held it because that was how he had been taught, and he had never once deviated from what he had been taught. Then the hand came down. The crack was enormous. Not like the tile breaking, like the air itself breaking. For tiles became 8 pieces became dust and rubble between the 2 wooden blocks. And Takeda's hand continued through them and stopped just above the floor, controlled and precise, as if he had simply passed his palm through smoke. The bleachers erupted. Even the Korean delegation clapped. Even the journalists forgot their notebooks for a moment. Somewhere in the upper rows a man shouted something in a language Tanaka didn't recognize, and the people around him laughed and clapped harder. Takeda straightened. He shook the dust from his hand with 2 short flicks and turned to face his students. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Sato called the students back into formation. The drills resumed, combinations now, punch and block and counter, the whole line moving together in that locked mechanical rhythm that had filled the room since the start. Takeda walked the edge of the floor slowly, watching, stopping occasionally beside a student to adjust a wrist, correct a stance, push a shoulder back half an inch. Each correction was made without words. A touch was enough. Sometimes just a look. Tanaka watched him move. Then he watched the man in row 1. The lean man in the plain shirt was watching the drills with the same calm attention he had shown from the beginning. His eyes followed the combinations, not the whole line, but individual movements, tracking something specific. His head tilted very slightly to one side, the way a person tilts their head when they are thinking about something they have already understood. Takeda reached the far end of the floor and turned. His gaze passed over the front rows, over the journalists, over the Korean delegation, and then it stopped again, the same way it had stopped before, on the lean man in the simple shirt, sitting with his open hands resting on his knees. This time it didn't move on quickly. Takeda stood at the edge of the floor and looked at the man the way you look at something that has been sitting in the wrong place for too long. The combination drill continued behind him. Sato's count kept its rhythm. But Takeda had already stopped being interested in the drill. He raised one hand. Sato's count stopped. The line of students froze mid-combination and held their positions. 40 people stood in perfect stillness and waited. Takeda walked forward slowly toward the front row. His hands were clasped behind his back now. He stopped at the low wooden railing that separated the floor from the bleachers, and he looked down at the lean man in the plain shirt from a distance of about 4 feet. The silence in the room was total. Then Takeda raised his right arm and pointed. One finger, straight and steady, aimed directly at the lean man's chest like a blade. He spoke in Japanese, loudly enough for the whole room to hear. You. A short pause. Tourist. A few of the students in the back rows exchanged glances. Someone near the top of the bleachers murmured something, and the person beside them covered a smile with their hand. Takeda's voice dropped slightly, but lost none of its weight. Come down. Show us your blocking. It was not a question. It was not an invitation. It was the kind of sentence that comes from a man who has never needed to ask twice for anything, in a room that has never given him a reason to. The lean man in the plain shirt looked up at the pointing finger. And then, without any change in his expression, without any hesitation, without a single word, he stood up. More 15-11 The walk from row 1 to the floor was not long. Maybe 15 steps. Past the knees of the people sitting between him and the aisle. Down the 3 short wooden steps at the end of the bleacher section. Through the narrow gap in the low railing, where Sato held one side open with a flat expression that said he had seen this kind of thing before and knew exactly how it ended. The lean man walked without hurrying. That was the first thing Tanaka noticed. Everyone who had ever been called onto that floor, every junior student, every visiting practitioner, every person who had ever found themselves on the wrong end of Takeda's pointed finger, had walked with some version of the same energy. Tight shoulders, a chin held a degree too high or too low. The careful, self-conscious movement of a person who is aware of being watched and is trying very hard not to show that they are aware of being watched. The lean man walked the way he had been sitting. Easy. Level. Like the 15 steps were just 15 steps, and the room full of people watching them was simply the room he happened to be in. He stopped at the edge of the polished hardwood and removed his shoes. He set them to the side neatly, straightened, and stepped onto the floor. A small sound moved through the bleachers. Not quite a murmur, more like a collective exhale. Takeda was already at the center of the floor waiting. He had not moved since issuing the challenge. His arms hung at his sides, and he watched the lean man cross the floor toward him with the patient stillness of someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the formality of it to begin. Up close, the contrast between them was sharp enough to draw breath. Takeda settled into his stance without announcement, without instruction, without even a glance downward at his own feet. It simply happened, weight dropping, left foot sliding forward, right foot anchoring wide and firm behind him, knees bending deep until his thighs were nearly parallel with the floor. Zenkutsudachi, the front stance, the foundation of everything he had built over 30 years. His front fist came up level with his shoulder. His rear fist pulled tight to his hip. His jaw set. His eyes locked forward. He looked like something that had been planted, like a post driven into the ground that no reasonable person would try to pull out. The students along the edge of the floor watched without breathing. Sato stood 3 steps behind Takeda and slightly to the right, arms folded, face unreadable. The lean man stopped about 6 feet away. He did not drop into a deep formal stance. He did not raise his fists to his shoulders or anchor his feet wide apart. What he did instead was so understated that several people in the front rows weren't immediately sure he had done anything at all. His weight shifted forward, just slightly, onto the balls of his feet. His knees bent the smallest amount, loose and ready rather than locked and loaded. His hands came up in front of him, relaxed, fingers open and slightly curved, neither fully closed into fists nor fully open into blades. Just hands. Available hands. His left foot moved about half a step ahead of his right, and his whole body settled into a kind of alert stillness. The stillness not of a thing at rest, but of a thing about to move. And then he began to move. Not attacking. Not retreating. Just a slow, continuous shifting of weight from foot to foot. A small, rhythmic bounce, barely visible, more like breathing than footwork. His shoulders stayed loose. His eyes stayed on Takeda. Tanaka leaned forward without realizing he had done it. One of the black belts in the front row unfolded his arms. The contrast was almost difficult to look at directly. Takeda, granite, deep, immovable, every line of his body a committed declaration. And across from him, the lean man in the plain shirt, shifting softly like something that lived in water. No hard lines. No declared intention. A shape that seemed to have no fixed edges. Takeda's eyes moved across the lean man's stance once, then again. Something behind them changed very slightly. Not doubt. Not yet. But the small, involuntary adjustment a man makes when he reaches for something familiar and his hand closes around something else entirely. Takeda decided to end it cleanly. That was the thought behind his eyes. Tanaka could see it from where he sat, though he couldn't have explained how. Something in the way Takeda's rear hand pulled back an extra inch, settling deeper against his hip. Something in the way his front foot pressed more firmly into the floor, loading weight into the back leg the way a spring loads before it releases. He wasn't angry yet. He was simply efficient. He had broken 4 inches of tile 20 minutes ago with the same economy of feeling. This would take less effort than that. He was going to throw one punch. One clean. Full power reverse punch, Gyakuzuki, straight down the center line. The kind of punch that had ended demonstrations before they properly began. The kind that landed in the chest and informed a person's body, in language that required no translation, that the conversation was over. Takeda exhaled once through his nose. Then he moved. The punch came from his hip like something mechanical, rotating, extending, accelerating through the full length of his arm with 30 years of the same motion stacked behind it. His rear foot drove into the floor. His hip turned over. His shoulder followed. His fist arrived at the end of that chain, moving faster than most people in the room could consciously track. It hit nothing. Not deflected. Not blocked. Not pushed aside. Nothing. His fist traveled its full distance and arrived at a point in space where a chest had been and found only air. The follow-through carried his weight slightly forward, and for one fraction of a second, one very small, very uncomfortable fraction of a second, Hiroshi Takeda was leaning into empty space. The room made a sound. It wasn't a gasp exactly. It was quieter than that and stranger. The sound a crowd makes when something happens that their eyes have reported, but their minds have not yet accepted. A soft collective intake. Several people in the upper rows stood without deciding to stand. The Korean delegation exchanged a single rapid look. One of the journalists pressed his pen hard against his notebook without writing anything. Takeda recovered his balance and turned. The lean man was standing behind him and to the right, about 4 feet back. He had not retreated to that position. He had not stepped around Takeda in any way that the front rows had been able to follow. He was simply elsewhere. Where he had been was empty. Where he now was felt like it had always been slightly inevitable. The way a shadow falls where the light dictates without anyone choosing it. His expression had not changed. His hands were still loose and available in front of him. His weight was still forward on the balls of his feet. The small rhythmic shift from foot to foot had not stopped. Not even during whatever had just happened. He looked like a man who had stepped to one side to let someone pass in a corridor. Calm. Unhurried. Completely present. Tanaka realized he was gripping the edge of his bench with both hands. Sato had not moved from his position, but his arms were no longer folded. They hung at his sides now. And his eyes were doing something they very rarely did inside this dojo, moving quickly, recalculating, looking for a framework that could hold what he had just seen. The students along the edge of the floor were absolutely still. Not the trained stillness of the drills. Something different. The stillness of people who have just watched the rules of the room change without anyone asking permission. Takeda stood with his back to the crowd for 1 full second. 2 seconds. When he turned, his face was composed. The flat professional authority was still there, still sitting across his features the way it always sat. But underneath it, just barely visible the way heat is visible above summer asphalt, something had shifted. His jaw was set a degree tighter than it had been. The skin around his eyes had pulled in slightly. He looked at the lean man in the plain shirt the way you look at a door you have pushed firmly and found locked. The lean man looked back at him, still bouncing softly on the balls of his feet, still waiting. Takeda told himself it was a teaching moment. That was how it began, with a reasonable thought, the kind a man reaches for when the unreasonable thing is already happening underneath it. He would press harder. He would show the students what happened when an opponent refused to engage properly. He would demonstrate that fluidity without foundation was just dancing, and that dancing had no answer for committed power. He told himself this clearly and carefully. Then he attacked. The second punch came faster than the first and from a different angle. A sharp lead jab aimed not at the center, but at the left shoulder, meant to pin, meant to establish contact, meant to give his rear hand something to follow. It was a combination he had thrown 10,000 times. It had worked on bigger men than the one standing in front of him. The jab found nothing. Not in the way the first punch had found nothing. That had been a clean miss. And a clean miss could still be explained. This was different. The lean man had moved inside the punch. Not away from it. Inside it, toward Takeda. Slipping the jab by a margin so small it was almost insulting. And for one disorienting instant, they were close enough that Takeda could see the buttons on the plain shirt. Then a hand touched his forearm. Not a strike. Not a block in any sense Takeda had been taught. More like a redirect, a light, almost gentle contact that found the energy in his extending arm and simply suggested a different direction for it. His own punch curved away from him like water around a stone. The lean man was already moving again before the contact ended, back to that loose, available position, weight forward, hands open. Takeda's professional composure cracked down the middle. He came forward with his elbow, a horizontal strike, short and devastating. The kind that didn't need distance to carry damage. The lean man rolled his shoulder, and the elbow passed over it. A knee followed immediately, driving upward toward the lean man's midsection. The lean man pivoted on his left foot with a single fluid turn, and the knee found air. Takeda threw a hook. The lean man parried it with his left hand, and in the same motion, the absolute same motion, not after, not following, but simultaneous one thing, his right hand fired back. Not a full punch. A straight, short strike aimed at Takeda's collarbone that stopped 2 inches from contact. Controlled. Deliberate. A question asked in a language Takeda understood perfectly. It had come and stopped before Takeda's block was halfway up. He reset and came again. And now the anger was no longer underneath anything. It was on the surface, in his breathing, in the extra force he was putting into each movement. Force that was costing him time, costing him accuracy, costing him the very precision he had spent 30 years building. He knew this. Some part of him that lived below the anger knew it clearly. He threw a ridge hand strike, parried and redirected. A front kick, slipped inside. A light touch at his hip guiding his own momentum past its target. A back fist. The lean man ducked under it and rose with a palm strike to the air just below Takeda's chin. Again stopping short, again controlled, again that same unbearable patience. Every time Takeda committed, the lean man was no longer where he had committed to. And every time the lean man responded, it arrived before Takeda's defense could form. As if the response had been sent slightly before the attack that caused it. As if the lean man was not reacting at all, but simply existing one small step ahead. The students along the wall had stopped pretending to hold formation. Sato's hands were at his sides, fingers open. Tanaka had stopped gripping the bench. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his glasses slightly down his nose. Watching with the focused attention of a man who knows he is seeing something he will spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately. Takeda pulled back and reset for the 4th time. His breathing was audible now. The lean man in the plain shirt settled back into his soft, patient bounce and waited with the same open hands and the same calm face he had carried onto the floor. As if he had not yet begun. Takeda came in low this time. He dropped his level suddenly, bending his knees deep, and drove forward with a tackle-style entry that had nothing classical about it. It was the move of a man who has run out of elegant options and has reached instead for something older and more desperate. Pure forward mass, pure commitment. The kind of attack that works because the body doing it has stopped caring about anything except closing the distance. The lean man sidestepped. Not back, not away. To the side and slightly forward, meeting the angle of Takeda's drive rather than running from it. His left hand found Takeda's lead shoulder as he passed and pressed. Just enough. Just precisely enough to help Takeda's own momentum carry him 2 steps further than he had intended to go. Takeda caught himself at the edge of the floor. 1 foot was 6 inches from the boundary line. He straightened slowly and stood there for a moment with his back to the room. And the only sound was his own breathing and the low hum of the overhead lights. Then he turned around. Something had left his face. The professional flatness was gone. The cold authority was gone. What remained was rawer than either of those things. The expression of a man standing in the ruins of a system he had believed in completely, looking at the damage with eyes that were not yet ready to understand what they were seeing. He walked back to the center of the floor. The lean man had not moved. He stood in his loose, easy posture, weight on the balls of his feet, hands available, that small continuous shift of weight still present like a pulse. There was no satisfaction in his face, no performance of victory. He was watching Takeda the way he had watched him from the beginning, with complete, quiet attention. Takeda reset into his stance. This time it looked different. The depth was still there, the technical precision still present in every angle and line. But something inside the stance had changed. The certainty was gone from it. It looked now like a habit rather than a conviction. The body doing what it had always done because it did not know what else to do. He came forward with a combination. Jab, cross, elbow, knee. The full sequence, committed and hard, each strike carrying everything he had left. The lean man moved through it like thread through a needle. The jab was slipped. The cross was parried with a forearm redirect that sent it wide. The elbow was ducked. And as Takeda rose from the duck, he walked directly into a straight lead that stopped against his sternum with a pressure that was not quite a strike, controlled at the last instant. As everything had been controlled, but firm enough that he felt it in his back teeth. He stepped away. His hands dropped 2 inches. It was a small thing. A tiny, involuntary lowering of the guard that lasted less than a second before his training pulled it back up. But every black belt sitting in the front row saw it. Sato saw it. The Korean delegation saw it. And the lean man, whose eyes had not left Takeda's center line since the moment he stepped onto the floor, certainly saw it. He did not exploit it. He stepped back instead, creating distance, and lowered his own hands slightly. A mirror of what Takeda had just shown, offered back without mockery, without theater. A pause. An acknowledgement. The room was so quiet that Tanaka could hear the person beside him swallow. Takeda stood at the center of the polished floor and looked at the lean man across from him, and for a long moment he did not move at all. The sweat on his face caught the overhead light. His chest rose and fell. His hands, those famous hands with their calloused knuckles and their 30 years of breaking things, hung at his sides. One of the senior students in the front row looked at the floor. Another looked at his own hands. Sato stood very still and said nothing and watched his teacher with the careful, pained attention of a student who has just seen something he cannot unlearn. Takeda's left hand opened slowly at his side. Then his right. Nobody in the room breathed. That was not an exaggeration. Tanaka would remember it that way for the rest of his life. The specific quality of the silence that settled over the Morimoto Dojo in the seconds before Takeda moved for the last time. Not the trained silence of the drills. Not the polite silence of an audience watching a performance. Something thicker than either of those. The silence of a room full of people who have collectively sensed that what is about to happen will not resemble anything that has happened before it. Takeda's hands came back up. The stance was there again, the deep front stance, the loaded rear leg, the fists positioned exactly where 30 years of practice had taught them to be. But the eyes were different now. The cold professional distance was gone. What had replaced it was something more honest and more dangerous. Pure feeling. The kind that strips a man down to his earliest instincts and leaves the training as just a thin surface over something much older. He was going to charge. Tanaka could see it before it happened the same way you can see rain before it falls. A change in the atmosphere, a shift in pressure. a quality of inevitability settling over everything. Beside him, the man from the Korean delegation had leaned so far forward, he was nearly off his seat. Somewhere in the upper rows a camera shutter clicked once, and then was still. Takeda exhaled. And then he came, not with a single technique, not with a combination, but with everything at once. A full forward charge, closing the distance in 2 driving steps, his whole body a single committed weapon aimed at the center of the lean man's chest. It was not elegant. It was not classical. It was the oldest attack in the world. One man throwing himself at another with total commitment, asking the universe to settle the matter. The lean man did not move back. He moved forward. 1 step, small, precise. Timed to the exact fraction of a second before Takeda's mass arrived. And he was inside the charge, inside the distance where Takeda's power needed room to exist. Where the big muscles couldn't fire properly, and the committed momentum became a liability instead of a weapon. They were close enough now that the lean man's plain shirt almost touched the white GI. His right hand rose. It did not swing. It did not hook or cross or drive from the hip. It simply extended, direct, immediate, traveling the shortest possible line from where it was to where it needed to be. The fingers came together into a point, slightly spread, and stopped. At Takeda's throat. 1 inch away. Maybe less. The hand was absolutely still. Not trembling with restrained force. Not shaking with the effort of stopping. Simply there, suspended. With a precision so complete it looked less like a fighting technique, and more like a surgical instrument placed against a vein. Takeda had stopped. His charge had ended not because he had been pushed back, not because he had been knocked down, but because something older and more fundamental than his training had told his body to stop. Every human nervous system carries that instruction somewhere below conscious thought, the recognition of mortal proximity, the sudden cold understanding of what the next inch means. He stood completely still. The lean man's fingers did not move. They rested in that fraction of space between the tip of his hand and Takeda's throat like the pause at the end of a sentence. Not the end of something, but the point at which everything that needed to be said had been said. The overhead lights hummed. The floor did not creak. Nobody shifted. Nobody coughed. The Korean delegation. The journalists, the senior students, the black belts in the front row. All of them frozen in a tableau that the room itself seemed to be holding in place, unwilling to release. Tanaka's glasses had slid to the end of his nose. He did not push them up. Sato stood behind and to the right of his teacher with his arms at his sides and his face carrying an expression that Tanaka had never seen on it before and would not see on it again. The open, unguarded look of a man who has just learned something important and is still in the first moment of knowing it. The lean man's eyes were on Takeda's eyes. Steady, patient, quiet as still water. And Takeda, the great Hiroshi Takeda, guardian of tradition, breaker of tiles and spirits. The man whose pointed finger had silenced this room 100 times, stood at the end of his own charge with another man's hand at his throat and could not move at all. Master Morimoto had not stood up during the entire demonstration. Not when Takeda shattered the tiles. Not when the lean man slipped the first punch and appeared behind Takeda like a shift in light. Not during the combinations or the charge, or the moment when everything in the room stopped and held itself around a single extended hand at a single throat. He had sat in his low chair at the edge of the floor with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes moving carefully over everything. The way a reader moves over a page he has read before, but is finding new meaning in. When the lean man lowered his hand and stepped back, Morimoto unfolded his hands. When Takeda stood motionless at the center of the floor, Morimoto placed both palms on his knees. When the silence reached its deepest point, that specific, total silence that follows something irreversible, Morimoto stood up. He was not a large man. He never had been. At 71, he was smaller than he had been at 50. The way old trees sometimes appear to shrink while becoming more themselves. He wore a plain dark GI with no insignia. His belt was so old its color was closer to gray than black. He walked without a cane and without hurrying, and the room parted its attention for him the way water parts for something that has always known how to move through it. He crossed the floor slowly. The students along the wall straightened without being told. The black belts in the front row, who had not changed their posture for anyone or anything in the past hour, sat up. Sato took one step to the side and lowered his eyes briefly, Not out of submission, but out of the particular respect a student shows when the person who taught his teacher enters the space. Morimoto stopped in front of the lean man. He stood there for a moment and looked at him the way you look at something you recognized from a great distance and are now confirming up close. His eyes moved over the plain shirt, the relaxed hands, the easy posture that had somehow remained easy through everything that had just happened. Then he looked at the lean man's face. The lean man met his gaze with the same quiet attention he had offered everyone else in the room. No performance, no modesty, just presence. Morimoto nodded once, slowly. Then he spoke the name. He said it in a normal voice, not loudly, not with ceremony, just clearly. The way you say the name of something when you want there to be no confusion about what it is. 2 words. They left his mouth and entered the front row first. And the front row received them like a current passing through, a visible, physical change moving from person to person, a rapid blinking, a small pulling back. A sudden and total recalibration of everything that had just been witnessed. One of the black belts turned to the man beside him and repeated the name in a whisper that was barely a whisper. The man beside him turned and passed it back. It moved through the room like fire through dry grass. Up through the middle benches where the journalists sat, one of them dropping his pen and not picking it up. Through the section where the Korean delegation sat in a row, and Tanaka watched the nearest one close his eyes briefly and open them again with a completely different expression. Up into the upper rows where the tourists and the businessmen and the people who had come for an afternoon's entertainment sat, and even there, even among people who had come with no particular knowledge and no particular expectation, the name landed with weight. Because some names carry their own gravity. They arrive in a room and rearrange everything in it retroactively, changing not just what people feel about the present moment, but what they understand about every moment that preceded it. Tanaka heard it reach the man beside him, and then heard it in his own mind, and looked at the floor where the lean man stood in his plain shirt with his easy hands, and felt the specific sensation of understanding arriving too late and too completely all at once. In the front row, a junior student who had laughed when the challenge was first issued sat with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes on the floor. He did not look up for a long time. The hand withdrew. Slowly, without drama, the way a tide pulls back from a shore, not retreating, just returning to where it belonged. The lean man lowered his arm to his side and took one small step back, creating space, and the spell that had held the room in place for those long, airless seconds began to dissolve at its edges. Someone in the upper rows let out a breath that was almost a word. Takeda had not moved. He stood at the center of the floor with his hands at his sides and his chest still rising and falling from the charge. And he looked at the lean man in the plain shirt with an expression that had no name in the vocabulary of this dojo. Not defeat. Defeat had a shape Takeda knew, had seen it on other faces, had inflicted it deliberately and recognized its specific geometry. This was not that. This was something that lived further down than defeat. In a place that defeat couldn't reach, because defeat still assumed that the original contest had meant something. What Takeda's face carried now was quieter than defeat. It was the look of a man standing at the far end of a long road he had walked with total confidence, discovering that it had led somewhere he had never intended to go, and finding that the place he had arrived was more honest than anywhere the road had promised to take him. Master Morimoto stepped forward. He had been sitting in a low chair at the far right edge of the floor since the demonstration began, still and largely unnoticed the way very old authority sometimes goes unnoticed. Not because it is weak, but because it no longer needs to announce itself. He was 71 years old, small and lean, with white hair and the unhurried movement of a man who had made peace with time. He walked to the center of the floor without any urgency and stopped beside Takeda. He looked at the lean man for a long moment. Then he spoke a name. It left his mouth quietly. Just 2 words, but they moved through the room the way a stone moves through still water. Outward in every direction at once. Reaching the front rows first, and then the middle benches, and then the upper rows, and everywhere they reached the same thing happened. Eyes widened. Postures changed. The whispered repetition of those 2 words passed from mouth to ear to mouth until the whole room was holding them. Tanaka heard it reach the man beside him, and watched the man's face go through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. He pushed his glasses up and looked at the floor of the dojo, where the lean man in the plain shirt stood with his hands at his sides and his weight still easy on the balls of his feet. And Tanaka thought about the calm face in row 1, and the open hands resting on relaxed knees, and the eyes that had not flinched. He thought, of course. Of course. Takeda turned to face the lean man fully. What happened next was not the bow of a student to a teacher, or a defeated man to his conqueror. It was deeper than the first, and had none of the bitterness of the second. It began at the waist and went down slowly and held there, a long, genuine bow. The kind that costs something to give, because it requires the giver to set down something heavy they have been carrying for a very long time. The lean man returned it. Equal depth. Equal stillness. Equal respect. When Takeda straightened, something in his face had settled into a new position. Not broken, not diminished, but rearranged. Simplified. The way a room looks after unnecessary furniture has been removed. More space. More light. The essential things more visible than they had been before. He turned to his students. They were watching him, all of them, the black belts in the front row, the junior students along the wall. Sato standing 3 steps back with his open hands and his rearranged face. Watching and waiting for what came next the way students always watch and wait. Ready to become whatever their teacher shows them how to become. Takeda looked at them for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was quieter than any voice he had used in this dojo before, that tomorrow's first drill would begin not with a technique, but with a question. The question every student would be required to answer for themselves before they threw a single punch. Not, what is my style? But, who am I without it?